You have trauma in your past. Dr. Steve Call will help you identify it and heal from it. We'll take a look at a man in the Bible that struggled to choose faith over fear. And Jack Dawson's life mission is pushing him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up on episode 115 of Manley with Andy. Now joining the podcast, Dr. Steve Call, author of a new book called The Deep-Rooted Marriage. A thoughtful and faith-filled approach to what's often left unspoken in our marriages, the stories of our traumas and pasts that shape how we connect, communicate, and navigate conflict. It's really not just for marriage, it's for everything in life. So we're going to jump into that in just a moment, Steve. But I love to start every conversation with the question, what do you think is the biggest challenge that men face today, and how do we overcome it?
Yeah, I know you start each of the podcasts with that question. I think it's a wonderful question. I would say for most men, if not all, there is a profound struggle with what we would just call futility, a sense of I'm not enough. However, we talk about I'm not enough, but in this particular conversation, more about I'm not enough relationally. I just don't meet the mark. I don't measure up. And I think for most men, if not all of us, that is a deep struggle, heartache, connected often to our past story. I just don't measure up. There's something inadequate about me, which leads into, maybe we'll talk more about this in a little bit, is this sense of feeling shame. Futility always leads us to feeling shame. Shame is this sense of accusation or judgment. Something's wrong with me. There's at a core, I just don't measure up. So I would say futility, and then, overcome it. I think the most significant part of our journey is how we offer up what is the actual struggle that we might be experiencing. Community, that word I think is a difficult word for many of us, but how we allow ourselves to be seen in community, to be known in community, that I think when we live in isolation, that loud message of not measuring up is so loud for us. So I think as we expose it, as we name it, as we reveal it, it tends to lose its grip, I think, over time.
Well, and I think, talking about identifying, your book about finding trauma and pasts and how that shapes us, and we'll jump into that. But let's start here with that. Do you think that everyone has trauma?
That question comes up so much in our conferences or in our intensives in any kind of teaching forum. I had one person in the front row one time say, well, what if I didn't have trauma? I think for many of us, we might see trauma as something, what we call capital T, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. For many of us, though, I would say it's what we refer to as lowercase trauma, lack of attunement from our caregiver, maybe some relational or emotional harm, judgment. I would say yes. I think most of us, if not all of us, and again, it's difficult to say all, but I would think, and I want to encourage the listeners that, and particularly for men, it's just a difficult word to connect to. Well, that's not me. That's not part of my story. So in what we write and what we talk about and what we teach, often it's more of the subtle trauma. It's the face of our caregiver. It's the body language. It's being unseen, needs not responded to, those kinds of things where trauma is really, it has this core meaning around violation. There's some form of violation, some form of harm, not always intentional, but often that's the impact.
I just read this stat and I thought it was interesting that most people, they develop their first phobia at the age of 13. And you were talking about, the trauma and how it comes from our childhood. And do a lot of those traumas, are they around that time, or is it younger or older?
It really depends. I mean, phobias are connected to fear, obviously, and fear is real. Like we're born with this innate emotional response to what appears dangerous or feels dangerous. For many of us, and I think for many of us in marriage, most of the trauma that we might have experienced is earlier on in our story, often not conscious, often in maybe even pre-verbal states. I work in the world of this lack of attunement. I think for many, many men in marriage, that's often part of their dynamic, part of their story, part of their history is this lack of attunement from their caregiver, particularly the maternal presence. And so I think for many of us, it's not always a singular event. Sometimes trauma is a singular event, but sometimes it's a repeated experience that can occur throughout our early years.
Okay, so yeah, you use the word attunement, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. So unpack that a little bit more.
Sure. I often use the imagery of, I'm in my 60s, and back
Mhm.
in the day when we had cars, when I would drive, we had the dials on the radio,
Mhm.
where you turn the dial and it's static, static, static. And then you come
Mhm.
into the radio station and it's crystal clear. That's what attunement sounds like and feels like. It's literally to define as tuning into, to bring into harmony. That you can attune. You are a relational being in response to the other. I think for many of us, that's part of our story is there might not have been this attuned presence to our needs, emotional need, physical need. And I think that was true for me in my story. I had a mother that was really distracted and unavailable emotionally. And so there was her gaze, literally her body, her face was turned away often. And so there was just
Mhm.
this lack of tuning into. And for many of us, I think that's part of our story. We don't see that as necessarily a trauma, but we can say, oh, I missed out on connection. I missed out on some form of relational experience that was meant to be part of my story.
So we talked a little bit about we probably all have trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed a guy recently who was a quadriplegic. His name is Kevin Chandler. And I asked him about if he wished his life was different. And he looked at me and kind of said, Andy, I don't know anything different. This is my life. And so, in the lens of trauma, if maybe we have deep trauma from years ago that we may not even know about because this is just,
Yes.
we've just lived life without it, how do we identify it and then start to heal from it?
Mm. I think that is so helpful is that for many of us that have endured trauma, we're, again, yes, we're not really aware of anything different. So, how do we bring it into light? I think that's a really important part of how we address trauma. When I have a past experience of trauma, most often it shows itself up or reveals itself in some form of relational dynamic, particularly for those that are married. Something gets reenacted, something gets remembered. When we have a trauma in our story that maybe has been unaddressed, we often have the very similar relational responses that we have in conflict. We have this relational response of fight, flight, freeze, or what we call fawn. Those are often what we could call trauma responses. And so when I feel something in my body, when we feel something in our bodies, sometimes that's connected to past story. And so that's been our hope is that we want to invite people, listeners, readers, to be aware of how the past is being played out in the present. So sometimes what's happening in the moment is connected more to our past. And that's where we want to invite people to cultivate this sense of awareness. Like, hey, I wonder what's happening in the moment that might be connected to something of my past.
I really appreciate that you and your co-author are just really honestly just raw about your
Mm.
marriage and your relationships and how that kind of forms how you write this book and talk about trauma. So talk a little bit about your marriage and your relationship and you uncovering kind of your own past trauma through this journey.
I mean, that, like, I want to say that happens all the time for Lisa and I. We've been
Mm,
married 38 years, and there are still moments where something of my past gets triggered in the present. Not triggered like necessarily a trauma trigger, but something gets remembered. I think as long as I've been doing this work, but also as long as I've been married, it just astounds me that that's still true. Recently, Lisa and I, we had our family over for Christmas dinner. Supposedly meant to be a wonderful experience. Lisa, my wife, would love to have a family photo. Somebody gets up to take the picture and she sort of nudges me in the gut and says, make sure you're not chewing. And I'm like, okay, it's no big deal. It's a really benign offering. It's a really benign request. And what I heard though was I heard, do it right. Don't cause a scene. Stay out of trouble. Why aren't you behaving? Those are connected to my story, meaning my family of origin story. My parents were very much into performance, doing the right thing, having the right appearance. And so something got activated for me. That's an example of how things play out for us, where I was sort of stuck when she said that. Like, why is that so important? Why does that matter? Of course, it matters to her. It's a big deal. The other night, one of our daughters called from college. Lisa and I are sitting at the dinner table, and our daughter calls, and Lisa looks at the phone and is about to answer, and chooses to answer. Now, of course, she does. She wants to talk to our daughter. What gets activated for me, though, in my story is I'm not that important. I don't really matter. What do? I do something very childlike. I get up from the table, I go into my office, I leave. I can't bear the heartache that Lisa chooses something or someone else over me. Now, that's not true, but that's what it feels like. That's connected to story. So I think these are the moments that we're inviting readers and listeners to say, hey, what's that about? What's that connected to? I mean, honestly, Andy, I'm surprised each time I get activated, or each time I experience something. You would think being at this age of life, it's no big deal. Like I've worked through it. And I think that's the hope in what we write, is that it's a journey. It's a journey of awareness.
I don't think I've ever heard it that way, saying get activated. I would think you'd say triggered, but I think, and I'm sure you're the professional here, but why use that word? And then what do we do when we get activated?
Hmm. I like activated because it neutralizes something around that, sometimes the language of triggered. We
Mm,
have searched and searched and searched for another word other than trigger, but I mean, again, trigger makes sense.
yeah.
I often use the word reaction. We have a reaction. We get activated. Sometimes we would even call it what we call dysregulated. Our body just goes into this fragmented state. I think the reactivity that we experience is often, again, connected to story. What we do with it in the moment is really important. The root and core part of what we hope for is that there's just awareness. And the awareness comes from just that curiosity. I love that
Mm,
phrase, that word, this curiosity. What's happening for me? What's
mm,
happening for me? If we're in the presence of another, which is the beautiful part of marriage at times, is the other can be curious. Hey, what's going on for you? What just happened?
mm,
Not out of blame, not out of accusation, but more of a reflective posture. Like, wow, I got really bothered by that statement, or I got really bothered by Lisa's request to not chew during the picture. What's that about? Can we be curious? And again, to me, it's a posture of kindness. It's a posture of being willing to say, hey, what's happening for you? Hey, what's happening for me? And I think for many of us, particularly men, often the story has been we're not as attuned to what's happening in our body. I've had to learn that. That wasn't necessarily modeled for me. If we can have that posture of curiosity, I think that really helps, not just to diffuse what's happening, but to try to make sense of what's happening.
mm. I love that idea. I think you probably come out of the same direction of for so long, we're guys, we got to toughen up and
Yeah.
we can't show weakness, we can't admit weakness. And as I go through this journey, and as you've listened to some of my podcasts, my
Mm-hmm.
goal is to pursue biblical manhood. You look at what Jesus did, he was never shy about going to that place of emotion
Mm.
and recognizing like what's happening around me. Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? So I appreciate this. So as guys, how do we, like you said, how do you become more attuned to what's going on inside you?
I love that that's your emphasis in your podcast. Lisa and I have been watching season 4 of The Chosen. And there's a really powerful scene when Lazarus comes out of the tomb and Jesus literally weeps. I mean,
Mm,
shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. It's a really profound, beautiful image of what we're invited to. There's this embrace of emotion, this embrace of my emotional state is a response to what just happened. I think that's what attunement again can look like and sound like and feel like. It's the honoring of what we feel. That image of what he portrayed to me is the invitation, I think, often for many of us, again, it wasn't modeled. My father was in the military, just hardcore, no emotion, don't reveal weakness. And so it can feel counterintuitive. It's a really important phrase, word counterintuitive. It just doesn't make sense to reveal emotion because of what we were told, what was modeled for us. So there's just something in the posture of being willing to allow what I feel to be named, experienced, revealed, spoken somehow in a way that honors what is true for my body.
because feelings aren't inherently bad, right?
No, they
I mean, it's
aren't.
funny we
Like,
have to say that.
I know it's true. Like we are born innately, we are born into this world with 4 primary emotions: anger, sadness, fear, and often some might say something like frustration, disappointed, something like that. Like we are hardwired to feel. And yet, quickly, what happens? Something gets told to our emotion, something gets communicated. They use the theory of distraction. Like, if I distract my infant child from what they feel, maybe they'll feel better, as if sadness and fear and anger aren't appropriate or aren't okay. So, yeah, we are born, we're hardwired to feel. We are feeling beings. We're not just human beings. We have feelings. And I just don't think we can emphasize that enough, that part of what gets shaped early on in our story is some messaging around what's wrong with you. You ought not to feel sad. You ought not to be angry. You ought not to be frustrated. But yet we're hardwired for it. So it's a little confusing.
Well, we talked a lot about trauma and haven't really jumped into this book, but it's such a good book. I want to talk a little
Oh,
bit about it at
thanks.
the end of the year of this
Yeah.
interview. Let's talk about this because I think this is such a powerful thing is I was reading this chapter about conflict,
Mm.
and I just think so often, I think it's the same thing with our emotions. We think emotions are bad, conflict is bad. But is it okay to have conflict in marriage? And how do we do it correctly if yes?
Yeah, absolutely. We often start in some of our teachings and intensives. Well, actually, Lisa and I will talk about conflict as a form of intimacy. Conflict can
Mm,
actually be a form of connection. But for many of us, what was modeled for us with regard to conflict is nowhere near that. It's something to avoid, it's something to not have. Some couples might say, "Oh, we don't have any conflict." And I would say, maybe you're missing out on some form of intimacy. Intimacy
mm,
is the sense of making known. Conflict is meant to move us toward one another. Often we'll start in some of our sessions or some of our intensives, we'll start with something like, what's the goal of conflict? Like if you were to write a mission statement or a vision statement around conflict, what would you write? And some people might say something like, to win, to
mm.
convince the other. And our work has been about reshaping and reframing the way we move toward conflict as perhaps the goal is something other than to win. Maybe the goal is seeking to understand the other. What if the goal of conflict is understanding rather than compromise? John Gottman and his wife have done fabulous work in marriage, and they have written some and done some research, and they said 70% of our differences are unresolvable in marriage. And that, I mean, we just pause for a moment and think we spend a
Yeah.
lot of time trying to resolve something we can't resolve. And so, really, the goal of conflict is meant to move us toward one another. It's meant to create understanding. It's a posture of openness. I like that imagery, open handedness to what the other might be bringing.
Well, because I heard you just told me that stat. I'd never heard that. And I just thinking, my first thought was 70%, then are we compatible?
Yeah.
Like, is there a perfect spouse? And what am I doing?
Yeah. Yeah. But it's about how we engage the conflict rather than how we get rid of it or how we avoid it.
Mm,
It's the how we engage. I think that's what we hope for many of our couples and many of our readers is maybe it shifts the dynamic of how we approach conflict. When I move toward Lisa with a posture of seeking to understand her in conflict, it diffuses some of the tension. Now that's not always true because I'm wired, I'm frustrated, I'm irritated. But if we can reshape and reframe maybe that vision or that mission statement of how we believe what conflict is meant to lead us toward.
I read the chapter. I thought this is such a good thing, and I hadn't heard it
Mm.
before. Your chapter about the importance of choosing each other through play. It
Oh
makes me
yeah.
think of, I don't know if you've read, Annie F. Downs has a book called That Sounds Fun. And she talks about how adults need to have more fun and find hobbies and do things. And it sounds like what you're talking about in in that chapter, because she says if you don't know what to do for fun, think about what you did when you were a kid on a nice sunny day,
Yes.
and summer day, and just, what did you do and
What did
why?
you do?
Why did you find
Mm-hmm.
that fun? So it kind of felt like when you were talking about the story about your wife just like climbing up the rocks, it was like, well, that's what she was going back to her childhood, what was fun.
Yeah.
So talk about that.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, I wrote that title. I would love to read some of that. I think where we go with play is the remembering that play is innate. We are hardwired. We are born into this world with this capacity to play. And often how we began our relationship with our partner or our spouse was formed out of those play moments, whatever those were. That's what drew us together. We enjoyed the presence of the other because what play communicates is nothing else matters. It's such an innate part of being a child is when we got to play with a caregiver that wasn't distracted, nothing else mattered. It said, I choose you. I choose to be with you. So play has this foundational dopamine hit, literally, of what it feels like to be chosen, what it feels like to be in the presence of one that has delight, that I want to be with you. That's what play communicates. And all of us have a story again around play, meaning what was the message around play in your story, in your as you grew up? Was it seen as something as frivolous, off limits? You only work and then you play. And where we want to again maybe reframe that experience of play is it's meant to move you toward each other. We all have different play styles. We might have different ways we do play, but at a core, I just cannot emphasize that enough. That when a couple is struggling in their marriage, often the first thing out the window is the lack of play. It's often a question I'll ask couples: how do you play together? What does that look like? So if there was one thing I could do, literally in pixie dust or wave the magic wand, it would be encouraging couples to play just a little bit more consistently throughout their journey, their life together.
Hmm. Yeah, so try that. There you go. I like it. Thank you. Thank you for something actionable because we're guys and we need just something to do. There you go.
So true. So true. I often like read a prescription, like play
Yes.
3 times a week, play 3 times a week for 15 minutes, whatever you enjoy doing together.
Now taking a look at the Bible, Judges 6, starting in verse 12. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family." The Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." Gideon replied, "If you're truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it is really the Lord speaking to me. Don't go away until I come back and bring my offering to you." He answered, "I will stay here until you return." So Gideon hurried home. He cooked a young goat, and with a basket of flour, he baked some bread without yeast. Then, carrying the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, he brought them out and presented them to the angel who was under the great tree. The angel of God said to him, "Place the meat and the unleavened bread on this rock and pour the broth over it." And Gideon did as he was told. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff in his hand, and fire flamed up from the rock and consumed all he had brought. And the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he cried out, "O sovereign Lord, I'm doomed. I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." "It is all right," the Lord replied. "Do not be afraid. You will not die." And Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and named it Yahweh Shalom, which means the Lord is peace. So here in Judges 6, we see God show up to a man named Gideon. He was timid, unsure, hiding out. And God calls him mighty hero before Gideon had done anything. Why? Because God doesn't speak to who you are right now. He speaks to who he's calling you to become. God tells Gideon to go rescue Israel. He says, "I am sending you." But what does Gideon do? He asks for a sign. If you're really going to help me, prove it. Now, thankfully, God is patient with Gideon. He gives him the sign. But here's the truth. When God already told you what to do, you don't need a sign. You need obedience. And how often do I do this? Delaying action because I'm waiting for some sort of confirmation. Something big, something dramatic, neon lights that just say yes. But what if God's already spoken through his word, his spirit, or his calling on my life? Why am I still waiting? Gideon wanted proof, but God had already given a promise. "I will be with you." That's better than any sign. So if God's calling you, that is your confirmation. So step forward in faith, not because you feel ready, but because he already said, go. Now entering the Hall of Heroes, Jack Dawson. At an age when most kids are learning their multiplication tables, Jack Dawson was learning to save lives. Fascinated by paramedics since he was a toddler, he went from pretending to perform CPR on teddy bears to actually teaching real-life emergency response techniques to adults. By the time he was 7, Jack was leading workshops on CPR and defibrillator use, confidently training groups as large as 100 people. Under the guidance of his father and their charity, he not only teaches but also ensures that defibrillators around town are properly maintained, because to Jack, every second matters in an emergency. And Jack's age isn't a barrier. It's actually his superpower. People don't just listen, they're inspired. If a 10-year-old can step up and take action, so can they. And his passion has earned him the nickname of Mini Medic, a social media following in the Children of Courage Birmingham Awards. But awards aside, his real mission is clear: to save lives and train others to do the same. So because Jack Dawson has dedicated his life as short as it may be, to teaching life-saving skills and proving that age is no limit to making a difference, he is officially in the Manley with Andy Hall of Heroes. So what does the word Christian really mean? Norman Hubbard will help you unpack the word in some new ways. What do you do when God calls you to do something that makes no sense? Gideon's story in the Bible has some insight for you. And Russell Cook was looking for purpose, so he did something no man has ever done before. And it's running him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up next week on Manley with Andy.